Much of what we know about the man known as George Chapman has been pieced together from the original investigator's notes and witness testimonies from his trial. Later details emerged through investigative researchers who relied heavily on an assortment of historical records. This fragmented approach was necessary because virtually nothing is known about Chapman's early life. He steadfastly refused to discuss it, and the few accounts he did provide were believed to be complete fabrications. This is a story you think you know, especially if you followed the Jack the Ripper mysteries over the years. Yet when you look closely at any single suspect, you realise how little you actually know about them. They were womanizers, killers of women, unlikely psychopaths. And this is not a story of who's right and who's wrong. It's just some condensed information of what I've tried to piece together in the old jigsaw with missing pieces that's George Chapman. Severin Klosowski was born in rural Poland in 1865, then part of the Russian Empire. The son of a carpenter, he attended a local school before being apprenticed as a teenager to the surgeon Moshko Rappaport in the town of Zwolen. There he received practical medical training and acquired a knowledge of anatomy, drugs and minor surgical procedures. Klosowski appeared to have applied himself well during his apprenticeship under Moshko Rappaport. Over several years he acquired the practical knowledge he would need for a surgical assistant. After completing his training, he found employment in hospitals and medical institutions, where colleagues later recalled him as a capable and knowledgeable worker. Although he never qualified as a doctor, his medical training gave him an understanding of drugs and poisons. After completing his medical training, Klosowski worked at a hospital in the Praga district of Warsaw. At some point, he made the journey to England. The exact date of Klosowski's arrival in Britain remains unknown. Evidence gathered after his arrest suggests that he was living in England by 1888 or 1889. A travelling hairdresser named Levishon, who had known Klosowski in Warsaw, later recalled meeting him again in Britain and formed the impression that he had arrived only recently. Among Klosowski's possessions, investigators also discovered a receipt showing that he had paid hospital fees in Warsaw in March 1887. The document confirmed that he was still in Poland at that date and indicates that his move to England took place sometime afterwards. When Klosowski arrived in Victorian London, he attracted little attention. Like thousands of others, he settled in the East End. He sought work and began building a new life. He found employment as a barber and hairdresser, a trade that offered opportunities for a newcomer with limited resources. Over the following months, he worked at several barbers' shops, including one in Whitechapel. One of the earliest glimpses of Klosowski's life in London comes from the testimony of Wolf Levishon, a travelling hairdresser who had known him in Poland. Years later, Levishon recalled encountering Klosowski again while he was working in a barber shop beneath the White Hart public house at 89 Whitechapel High Street. Levishon believed this meeting took place in 1888. However, the chronology is not entirely clear. Other evidence suggests that Klosowski's earliest known employment in London was with Abraham Radin on West India Dock Road, followed by a period working in Cable Street, and that his association with the White Hart premises may not have begun until around 1890. As a result, some historians have questioned Levishon's dating of the encounter, although not the meeting itself. Levishon encountered him again at another shop later on West Green Road in South Tottenham. Their chance meeting would later help investigators piece together Klosowski's movements before he became known in Britain as George Chapman. Klosowski sought to improve his prospects. After gaining experience as a barber, he acquired a shop of his own on Tottenham High Road. For a time it appeared that he was establishing himself as an independent tradesman, but the venture proved unsuccessful and the business eventually failed. Rather than remaining in one place, Klosowski continued to move between jobs and districts across East London, before later finding employment at a barber shop in Church Lane, Leytonstone. There he reportedly earned around 30 shillings a week, a respectable wage for the period. Employers and colleagues generally described him as quiet, reliable and hard-working. Nothing about Severin Klosowski outwardly hinted at the crimes he would later commit as George Chapman. To employers and acquaintances, he generally appeared to be a quiet and respectable tradesman making his way in Victorian London. Not long after arriving in England, Klosowski became involved with a young Polish woman named Lucy Badowski. Later accounts suggest that the pair met through London's Polish community, possibly at a social club in St John's Square, Clerkenwell, a popular gathering place for Eastern European immigrants. What is certain is they married during the August bank holiday of 1889 after a relative brief courtship. No reliable evidence survives as to why the haste of the marriage. The couple soon had a son, but the child died in infancy. The loss was an early tragedy in what would prove to be a turbulent and troubled marriage. To those that knew him, Klosowski appeared to be an ordinary barber making his way in Victorian London. Few could have imagined that the seemingly respectable tradesman would later become one of the most notorious poisoners in British criminal history. Life was not easy for the newly married couple. Like many working-class families in Victorian London, they lived in cramped accommodation and shared their lodgings with other occupants. According to accounts that surfaced years later, the marriage was disrupted by the arrival of another woman who claimed to be Klosowski's lawful wife. Sources differ as to whether she was Polish or Russian, and the details of the episode remain uncertain. Some reports allege that both women lived under the same roof for a time, creating tensions within the household. What became of this mysterious woman is unknown. She eventually disappeared from the historical records and has never been conclusively identified. Whatever the truth of the story, Lucy remained with Klosowski, yet stability seemed elusive. Financial pressures, frequent moves and strains within the marriage continued to shape their lives during the early years of their relationship. But in 1891, Klosowski and Lucy left England and travelled to the United States, where he established himself as a barber in Jersey City. 2 more Ripper-style murders occurred there in early 1892. Chapman then returned to Britain sometime in 1892. It's also claimed that the murders stopped in Jersey City in 1892. Their stay was relatively brief, and in early 1892 Lucy returned to London while she was pregnant with the couple's second child, but they left Klosowski behind in America. The reasons for her departure were unclear. Later accounts suggest that the marriage had become troubled and alleged that Klosowski's behaviour towards other women had caused tension between the couple. Some reports even claim that he had threatened Lucy with a knife, although the details are difficult to verify and rely largely on testimony that emerged years later. Whatever the cause of the separation, Klosowski followed Lucy back to England several months later, and the couple resumed living together for a time in the East End. Their daughter Cecilia was born on the 15th of May 1892. The reconciliation proved short-lived, however, and the marriage soon collapsed. Lucy eventually left with Cecilia, and although the couple separated permanently, there is no clear evidence that they ever obtained a formal divorce. And that's important. After returning to London, Klosowski resumed work as a barber and hairdresser. Around this period, he became involved with a young woman named Annie Chapman. It was also at about this time that he began using the name George Chapman, adopting the surname by which he would later become notorious. The reasons for the change of name remain uncertain. Some writers have suggested that he took Annie's surname, while others have argued that he simply wished to establish a new identity in England. Whatever the motivation, the name George Chapman soon replaced Severin Klosowski in his everyday life. According to later accounts, Chapman briefly resumed his relationship with Lucy while continuing to live with Annie. It was alleged that Lucy moved into the household and that Annie was introduced as a housekeeper to conceal the unusual domestic arrangement. If true, the situation did not last. Annie eventually left, and reports from the time suggest that she later gave birth to a son in 1895, and it's believed by some to have been Chapman's child. The boy died the following year. By the mid-1890s, Lucy had also left Chapman for good. His first marriage had effectively come to an end, and he was now living entirely under the identity of George Chapman. By 1895, the man now calling himself George Chapman was working in Leytonstone and lodging with the family. While there, he got close to Mary Isabella Spink, who was now lodging there with her young son William. Her absent husband, Shadrach Spink, had worked for the Great Eastern Railway. He was a heavy drinker and had left her, taking their young son with him. It's said that Mrs. Spink also liked her drink. She had given birth to another child, William, in 1888, not long after her husband had left her. While she and Chapman were still there, they were seen kissing, and a disgusted landlord didn't like this display and confronted Chapman, who assured him that it was all right as he and Mrs. Spink were going to be married. Later, in the 1890s, Chapman was living with Mary Spink, and the couple presented themselves publicly as husband and wife. On the 27th of October 1895, they appeared to formalise this arrangement, although neither party is known to have been legally free to marry. No evidence has been found that either Chapman or Mary Spink had obtained a divorce from their previous spouses, meaning any legal marriage would have constituted bigamy. Mary had inherited a sum of money, often estimated at around £600, which provided the couple with a degree of financial stability. Records suggested that portions of this inheritance were later accessed and used in Chapman's business ventures. During this period, he leased and operated barbershops, including premises in Hastings. But his enterprises struggled in poorer parts of town, leading to a further move and changes of address. Later accounts describe increasing strain within their relationship, although the extent of it is difficult to verify. What is clear is that Chapman's personal and financial difficulties continue. Around this time, he also began forming relationships outside the household. One such episode involves a domestic servant, Alice Penfold, whom Chapman reportedly courted while presenting himself as a bachelor. The relationship did not progress, and she is said to have rejected his advances. The family moved to another home and were there for just over 6 months. It was here that Mary was first struck by stomach pains and repeated bouts of vomiting. So it's been suggested later that Chapman had got hold of some tartar emetic. Nobody thought much about it other than she'd got a stomach sickness or her drinking was making her sick. It would later be revealed that Chapman had obtained an ounce of tartar emetic on the 3rd of April 1897, a highly poisonous antimony compound from Mr. Davison, a chemist. The purchase had been carefully entered into the chemist's poisonous book, leaving behind a valuable record for future investigators. He had bought enough to kill a lot of people. 15 months later, after draining the last of Mary's inheritance, they sold the George Street shop to Mr. Edwin Robinson. Before anyone knew what was happening, the couple and Anne's young child had moved on once again. George Chapman later became associated with the Prince of Wales beer house in London, where he took on the role of landlord. Mary's inheritance had provided the couple with financial support, and they settled into running the bar. Only a few months after moving into the Prince of Wales pub in late 1897, Mary became seriously ill. Aside from the effects of heavy drinking, there had been no serious concerns about Mary's health until now. Mary was confined to bed, suffering from vomiting, stomach cramps, and severe abdominal pain. Chapman, it was claimed, was the only person to attend to Mary until it became too much for him to run the pub and watch over her. He hired a neighbour named Martha Doubleday to assist in looking after Mary. It became apparent to Martha that a doctor should be called, but Chapman seemed reluctant. But Mrs. Doubleday insisted that Mary needed medical attention. Chapman called Dr. Rogers to examine Mary. He told Chapman Mary was wasting away. He left a prescription and sent a woman to sit with Mary through the nights, and a kind-hearted neighbour watched over Mary through the day. According to some accounts, Mrs. Doubleday and some staff were a little suspicious of Chapman. It was truly unfortunate that there was no police involvement at that time. Unfortunately, Mary's condition worsened. She suffered a painful decline and passed away on Christmas Day, 1897. A doctor was called and issued a death certificate attributing her condition to phthisis, a term commonly used at the time for a wasting illness such as tuberculosis. No post-mortem examination was carried out, and her death was recorded without further investigation. Chapman continued his daily routine, and there is no evidence that his behaviour at the time of Mary's death attracted official suspicion. A 36-year-old woman named Bessie Taylor travelled to London possibly to take a position as a housekeeper at a hotel or a manager at a restaurant. It depends on the source. Either way, she would eventually meet George Chapman. She was originally from Streatham near Lymm and had once worked as a housekeeper and possibly a domestic servant. She came from a good, loving family and was well liked by those who came to know her. She was, by all accounts, far superior than Chapman in many ways, and people found it difficult to understand why she would agree to the arrangement of living in sin, as it were. The relationship she had with Chapman blossomed, and by Easter 1898, Chapman had once again entered into another marriage. Some sources claim Bessie knew the marriage wasn't legal and went along with it, but there's no proof of that. Bessie's family were against the marriage, but were cordial with Chapman for Bessie's sake. There was not much information on the marriage, but according to family and friends of Bessie, they didn't notice anything wrong between the couple, and others seemed to feel the same way. In August 1898, Chapman sold the lease of the Prince of Wales and bought the lease of the Grapes at Bishop's Stortford in Hertfordshire. Bessie, who was perfectly healthy before meeting Chapman, started to feel ill, and her health began to decline. While they were living there, one of Bessie's old friends, Elizabeth Painter, came to stay for a couple of weeks. According to Painter, her friend was suffering from painful swelling in her face, which Bessie thought was connected to problems with her teeth. Elizabeth helped with the bar while Bessie was admitted to hospital for an operation. Although it's not known for what exactly, it's believed it may have been for a dental procedure. Later reports suggest her dental problems may actually have been connected to the early effects of poisoning. When Bessie returned home, it was claimed Chapman's behaviour towards Bessie had changed. Witnesses told of some mistreatment towards her, both verbal and physical. He left the Grapes and moved back to London, but this time he had no intention of looking after young Willie, Mary's child, any more. At the age of 10, Chapman put Willie into Shoreditch Workhouse around the 20th of March 1899. Then reports show around the 9th of May, Willie was again moved to the workhouse's dedicated children's home. This poor child had been through so much in his very young life. On the 23rd of March 1899, Chapman purchased the lease of the Monument Tavern in Union Street, Southwark. There everything escalated, the ill treatment towards Bessie and Bessie's ill health. Bessie had befriended a neighbour who helped out as a sick nurse, Martha Stevens. She spoke with Martha about her health and Martha advised her to go to the hospital. Bessie was reluctant to go, so Martha went with her to see the doctor, Dr. James Stoker. After a number of visits, her health improved slightly, but this didn't last long, with the same symptoms returning. Chapman went to Dr. Stoker to ask for medication for Bessie's stomach problems. Of course, he would go on to continue poisoning Bessie's food and drinks. To witnesses, he looked like the devoted husband. There wasn't anything he wouldn't do for Bessie, making sure she was well looked after, taking care of her at all times, and having the best of foods and drinks. But Bessie was wasting away. She couldn't keep any food or drink down. Martha Stevens was now caring for Bessie and saw how bad she was. The doctor visited daily and Bessie's friend called most evenings. Dr. Stoker was stumped. He didn't know what was causing Bessie's symptoms, so he asked other doctors for their opinions. Dr. Ellerman said it was hysteria. Dr. Sunderland and Dr. Cotter thought it was cancer of the stomach or intestines. They took a sample of her vomit to check for cancer, but the result was negative. In 1901, Bessie's mother arrived to sit by her daughter's bedside, where she stayed, and Nurse Stevens was also a constant at the bedside. Nurse Stevens gave Bessie her medication, and with all this attention around her, after a little while, Bessie showed some improvement. As the days passed, Bessie was able to get out of bed and get dressed. The doctor was delighted and dismissed Martha. Everyone was happy. Bessie's mother had watched her daughter improve, and it was time for her to return home. Within a day, Bessie was sick again. She was very sick, and Nurse Stevens returned. The sickness continued for days. This time both Bessie's parents stayed by her side. And in the early hours of the 13th of February 1901, Bessie passed away. Her death was officially recorded as being due to intestinal obstruction, exhaustion from vomiting, and diarrhoea. 6 months later, while still at the Monument Tavern, Chapman noticed an advertisement placed by a young woman looking for a situation as a barmaid. Her name was Maud Marsh. Maud was living with her parents, who were understandably concerned about where their daughter would end up working and who she would be working for. So when Chapman offered Maud the position, Mrs. Marsh accompanied her daughter to the tavern to check out his living situation and to meet the man. When looking around the premises, Chapman told her he didn't live there alone, saying a family lived on the top floor and that he was a widower. Obviously, neither statement was that true. Maud's parents seemed happy with the situation. Everything seemed as per usual to go smoothly at the beginning. Maud settled into her duties and was happy. Everyone at the pub liked her, and Maud liked the place. But it didn't take long before Chapman had started with the charm. Within days he had bought Maud gold jewellery, and his pattern of behaviour would continue, with his new young victim innocently falling for the monster's charms, and of course they became engaged. Chapman's little fun way of getting what he wanted. Meanwhile, back at Maud's parents' house, her mother, already concerned, became even more worried when a letter from her daughter arrived telling her of her employer's demands. if she didn't give herself to him before marriage, she would be sent home. Her mother wrote back straight away, telling her not to give in to the man's pressures and to come home. She didn't. Instead, she wrote back claiming she was being silly at the time and not to worry, as there was just friendship between them at the time. She said she would visit her parents on the following Sunday. There were doubts as to who had worded the letter. Maud's father couldn't settle and went to the tavern himself. He gave his daughter some good advice she unfortunately ignored. He advised her not to keep secrets from him and asked her to tell him honestly about anything that happened between this man and herself. He told her not to do anything rash, as she barely knew the man. Maud did go and visit her parents. In fact, she turned up with Chapman. The couple had cycled to Croydon on the Sunday afternoon, and Chapman told Mrs. Marsh that he would like to marry Maud. Mrs. Marsh said she would discuss it with her husband. Mr. Marsh had been admitted to hospital at this time, and Maud visited him on a couple of Sundays. In late September 1901, Chapman had a will drawn up, making Maud his sole beneficiary. He asked Mrs. Marsh and one of her children, 16-year-old Alfred, to witness it. Mr. and Mrs. Marsh would give their consent to the marriage, but both parents told her not to do anything without telling them first. The will was obviously worthless. On Sunday the 13th, Maud and Chapman claimed to have been married at a Catholic church in Bishopsgate Street, but people had their suspicions. When Maud's mother arrived at the tavern, she saw the confetti and realised her daughter had married. Maud's mother did not trust Chapman. She was angry and demanded to see the marriage certificate. Maud claimed they hadn't told anyone about the wedding because Chapman didn't want a fuss. Mrs. Marsh had had doubts from the beginning about him, and her doubts were growing every day. The more her parents questioned her, the more convinced they became that they were hiding something. Her parents absolutely believed Chapman had persuaded her to take part in a deception. Not long after the wedding, a neighbour claimed to have noticed some expensive-looking items being removed from the Monument pub. Chapman had gone away for a few days, leaving instructions for Maud and to lock up the pub and stay with her parents while he was away. That night, when Maud was on her way to the station with her sister Daisy, she claimed to have forgotten something and turned to hurry back. She then returned to her sister and they went to Croydon. That same night, Chapman sneaked into the Monument and started a fire in the cellar. Afterward, he joined Maud at her parents' house. It is said that Maud was told to say they were staying there to visit Mr. Marsh before he went into the hospital the next day, if anyone asked. The Monument pub was left badly damaged by the fire, although the rooms upstairs remained largely habitable. Newspaper reports soon appeared describing how the landlord had seemingly vanished in the aftermath of the blaze. The stories infuriated Chapman and revealed a far more aggressive side to his character. He confronted one journalist, both at the newspaper offices and later in the street. The fire was investigated on behalf of the insurance company, and evidence gathered by the investigators led them to conclude that it had been started deliberately. Chapman, however, had an alibi for the time the fire was believed to have begun, and no charges were ever brought against him. He submitted a claim for around £400 in insurance money, although it appears he received only a portion of the amount he expected. The episode added to a growing reputation for questionable business practices. During his years as a publican, several acquaintances described Chapman as opportunistic, dishonest, and willing to bend the rules when it suited his interests. Chapman wasn't down and out by any means. He had money. He bought the lease for the Crown pub. The couple moved in and by all accounts were content. Maud's parents were not visiting as much at this time, but the rest of her family visited and kept them informed. It soon became apparent to her sister that Maud was afraid of Chapman, and she admitted to her that he had hit her on more than one occasion. His affections were changing towards her, and he became more dominant and possessive. The death of Queen Victoria on the 22nd of January 1901 marked the end of an era and plunged Britain into a period of national mourning. Businesses closed, entertainment was curtailed, and public attention focused on the passing of the monarch who had ruled for more than 60 years. For George Chapman, however, the timing proved unexpectedly beneficial, as the country mourned and then prepared for the accession of the coronation of King Edward VII. But it proved financially productive for Chapman, where he was able to sell tickets for upstairs window views of the king going by. Unfortunately, the future king became ill and the coronation was postponed. Chapman had hired a barmaid named Florence Rayner, and it was not long before he began paying her special attention. The arrangement in the pub struck some observers as unusual. By this stage, Maud appeared to have little influence over her husband's behaviour, and Chapman seemed free to conduct himself as he wished. According to later testimony, Maud would serve customers behind the bar, while Chapman and Florence sat down together for their meals. Afterwards, Florence would take her place behind the bar, while Chapman remained seated with her. Florence later told investigators that Chapman had asked her to become his sweetheart, and she eventually agreed. His infatuation appeared to grow quickly. At one point, he even proposed that the two of them start a new life together in America. According to Florence, Chapman planned to send her ahead and then follow later himself. When detectives later examined Chapman's affairs, they uncovered documents showing that the Crown Public House had been placed on the market just weeks before Maud's death. The discovery would raise further questions about Chapman's intentions during the final months of her life. According to some accounts, there was a lot of tension in the household, and Maud threw some home truths at Chapman. It wasn't long after this that Florence moved out, but it's believed she was thrown out. Before long, Maud began suffering from a mysterious and debilitating illness. It was a disturbing pattern that, in hindsight, seemed all too familiar in Chapman's relationships. At first, nobody could explain what was wrong with her. Some later speculated that because Chapman did not want her to have a child, he may have given her something to prevent pregnancy. But there was never any direct evidence to prove this. What was certain was that Maud's health was deteriorating. She suffered repeated bouts of sickness, severe stomach pains, and an overwhelming weakness that left her increasingly frail. Concerned by her condition, Maud's sisters urged her to seek medical help. Chapman eventually agreed that they could take her to a doctor, but insisted that she was not to be admitted to hospital. When the sisters discovered that the doctor was unavailable, they decided to take matters into their own hands. Believing they could slip past the Crown without Chapman noticing, they escorted Maud to Guy's Hospital instead. There, junior doctors examined her and treated her for what they believed was severe constipation. Maud remained in hospital for some time, and with the pub short-staffed, sent her sister Alice back to the Crown to help behind the bar. But when Maud eventually returned home, Chapman was far from pleased. The following morning, according to Maud's sister, Chapman gave Maud a drink that she later claimed made her feel unwell. Concerned, her sister asked why she had taken it if it had made her feel sick. Maud reportedly replied that Chapman had stood over her until she drank it. As the days passed, Maud's condition deteriorated rapidly. Eventually she was admitted to Guy's Hospital. By then she was suffering such severe pain that even the slightest touch caused her distress. The doctors treating her failed to recognise the signs of poisoning. Instead, they diagnosed what was then known as bowel consumption, a form of tuberculosis affecting the intestines. Maud remained in hospital for some time and underwent the treatments considered appropriate for the condition. Gradually her health improved, to the relief of her family. She appeared to make a full recovery and was eventually discharged. Chapman wasted no time in collecting her and bringing her home. But the improvement would be short-lived. Not long after returning to the Crown, Maud's health began to fail once again. The symptoms were hauntingly familiar, but this time they appeared even more severe. She suffered violent bouts of sickness and diarrhoea, agonizing stomach pains, and increasing weakness. Confined to her bed and growing steadily worse, Maud required medical attention once more. Chapman called for Dr. Stoker to attend to her. As Maud's condition worsened, family members began noticing troubling details. According to later testimony, she often managed to keep down food and drink prepared by other people. Yet on several occasions, after consuming something from Chapman, she was violently sick once again. Dr. Stoker returned to examine her and found many of the same symptoms he had encountered before. Once again he struggled to identify the cause of her illness. He prescribed treatments he believed appropriate, and while they occasionally brought some relief, Maud's overall condition continued to deteriorate. Despite her worsening health, she was reluctant to return to hospital. To those around him, Chapman appeared to be the picture of a devoted husband. Witnesses later recalled how attentive he was, constantly at Maud's bedside and seemingly willing to do anything to ease her suffering. A daily charwoman named Jessie Toone was employed to help care for Maud. Chapman entrusted her with many tasks, but notably she was not permitted to prepare or handle Maud's food. Dr. Stoker regarded Jessie as a capable and reliable woman, and she soon became an important witness to the events unfolding inside the Crown. As the weeks passed, nearly everyone agreed that Chapman appeared deeply concerned for his wife. He fussed over her constantly and rarely left her side. Yet not everyone was entirely at ease. Maud's father, who had come to sit at his daughter's bedside, began to feel that something was not quite right. On one occasion he noticed that water Chapman had brought for Maud appeared to have a yellowish tint. This troubled him, but he tried to dismiss his concerns. He believed his daughter loved Chapman, and he had no reason to suspect the man he regarded as her husband. Others were becoming concerned as well. During a visit, Mrs. Marsh and Maud's sister, Louise, suggested seeking a second medical opinion. Chapman reacted sharply, insisting that Dr. Stoker was the finest doctor available and arguing that if he could not discover the cause of Maud's illness, no one else could. Later that day, when Dr. Stoker arrived, Mrs. Marsh raised the matter directly with him and asked whether he would object to their family doctor, Dr. Grapple, examining Maud. Far from objecting, Dr. Stoker welcomed the suggestion. By then he was increasingly frustrated by the mystery of Maud's illness and was more than willing for another doctor to assess the case. Mrs. Marsh immediately sent for Dr. Grapple. The following morning, Maud's father went to see Dr. Francis Grapple, the young doctor he respected. Deeply worried about his daughter's condition, Mr. Marsh told the doctor of his fears for his daughter. He told the doctor that he believed something was seriously wrong and that he suspected Maud was being harmed. When Dr. Grapple arrived at the Crown, Dr. Stoker was summoned so that both men could examine the patient together. Chapman was clearly unhappy that the Marsh family had sought another opinion without consulting him. Tensions within the household were growing, and at one point Mrs. Marsh remarked to Jessie Toone, the housekeeper, that if Maud died, she intended to pay for a private post-mortem examination. Jessie promptly repeated the conversation to Chapman. The two doctors conducted a thorough examination of Maud, and by this stage Dr. Stoker was becoming increasingly puzzled by her symptoms. According to later testimony, he raised the possibility that some form of irritant poison might be involved. He even stated that should Maud die, he intended to carry out a post-mortem examination himself. Significantly, he made the remark purposefully in front of Jessie Toone, knowing there was a good chance that Chapman would hear about it. Dr. Grapple was also troubled by what he saw. The symptoms were consistent with arsenic poisoning, a possibility that crossed his mind during the examination. However, he did not immediately share his suspicions with Dr. Stoker. Mrs. Marsh told him that Maud herself wondered whether some rabbit she had eaten might have caused her illness. Dr. Grapple dismissed the idea. In his view, the rabbit could not account for the symptoms he was observing. Yet suspicion was one thing, proof was another. At that point, he could not say with certainty what was causing Maud's condition, nor could he prove that Chapman was responsible. As Maud's parents kept vigil at her bedside, Mr. Marsh questioned Chapman about his previous wife. During the conversation, Chapman admitted that she had suffered symptoms remarkably similar to those now afflicting Maud. Looking back, the warning signs seemed difficult to ignore, yet no one was prepared to make a direct accusation. Next day, Mr. Marsh visited Dr. Grapple's surgery once more. There the doctor shared his private opinion. He believed Maud had been poisoned with arsenic. Despite that alarming conclusion, he remained optimistic. Maud was still relatively young and strong, he said, and he thought she had a good chance of recovering. That same day, Maud died, with her mother and Chapman by her side. Chapman, according to Mrs. Marsh, was greatly upset. When Dr. Stoker arrived, he found that Maud was dead. This time he refused to issue a death certificate. He was no longer prepared to certify a cause of death that he could not satisfactorily explain. According to later accounts, Chapman insisted that the cause was obvious. It was simply exhaustion brought on by inflammation of the bowels. But Dr. Stoker was no longer willing to accept such explanations at face value. What caused the inflammation, he reportedly asked. The vomiting and diarrhoea, Chapman replied. And what caused the vomiting and diarrhoea, the doctor asked. This time Chapman had no answer. For the first time, a doctor had challenged the chain of assumptions that surrounded Maud's illness. Rather than accepting the symptoms as the explanation, Dr. Stoker wanted to know what had caused them in the first place. That question would prove crucial. It helped set in motion the investigation that would ultimately uncover the truth about George Chapman. Meanwhile, Maud's father, Mr. Marsh, went straight to Dr. Francis Grapple and informed him of his daughter's death. The doctor was shocked. Only recently had believed that Maud was beginning to recover. Realizing the significance of what had happened, Dr. Grapple immediately sent a telegram to Dr. Stoker. In it, he urged him to test specifically for arsenic poisoning and outlined the reasons for his suspicions. Dr. Stoker decided to act at once. Without waiting for instructions from the coroner, he arranged for a private post-mortem examination. After obtaining the necessary authority to remove the body to the mortuary, Dr. Stoker was joined by Dr. Patrick Cotter, Dr. Theodore Poirot, and Dr. Herbert French. Together they carried out a detailed examination. At first the results were frustrating. No obvious cause of death could be found. There was nothing visible to explain why a previously healthy young woman had declined so rapidly and died. But Dr. Stoker was not prepared to leave the matter there. He carefully removed Maud's stomach and its contents, along with samples from other organs. These were sealed in specially prepared containers and the following morning taken to the Chemical Research Association in Borough High Street. Their analytical chemist, Richard Bodmer, was asked to conduct tests specifically for arsenic. The results arrived later that evening. What they revealed would transform a mysterious death into a murder investigation. Arsenic had been detected in the samples taken from Maud's body. To Dr. Stoker, it was the breakthrough he had been searching for. For the first time, there appeared to be scientific evidence that Maud's death was not the result of a natural illness. He acted immediately, notifying the coroner, Dr. Waldo, and informing the police of the discovery. Although the investigation would later establish that antimony rather than arsenic was the principal poison involved, the analyst's findings were enough to transform a suspicious death into a murder inquiry. The chain of events set in motion by Dr. Grapple's suspicions and Dr. Stoker's determination was now leading investigators directly towards George Chapman. What had begun as a baffling medical mystery was suddenly being treated as something far more sinister: murder. On the morning of the 25th of October 1902, London was preparing for the long-delayed coronation procession of King Edward VII. Amid the celebrations, Detective Inspector Godley, accompanied by Sergeants Kemp and Leake, arrived at the Crown Public House and arrested Chapman. He was taken to the police station in Borough for questioning. While Chapman was being interrogated, detectives carried out a thorough search of his premises. What they discovered only deepened their suspicions. Among the items seized were quantities of white powders, a large collection of personal papers, and a considerable amount of money, almost £300 in cash and gold, a substantial fortune for the period. The documents proved especially significant. As detectives examined them, they uncovered a hidden history. The man known throughout London as George Chapman was, in fact, Severin Klosowski, a Polish immigrant who had spent years reinventing himself under different identities. The discovery opened the door to his past. Investigators began piecing together a story that stretched back decades. A trail of aliases, relationships, questionable marriages, and women who had suffered strikingly similar illnesses. That same evening, Chapman found himself facing the most serious accusation of his life. He was formally charged with the murder of Maud Marsh. For years he had hidden behind false names and carefully crafted personas: barber, publican, medical assistant, devoted husband. Now those identities were beginning to crumble. The investigation that followed would reveal that Maud's death was not an isolated tragedy. Detectives would soon uncover evidence linking Chapman to a pattern of poisoning that stretched back years. George Chapman was no longer simply a suspect in a single murder case. He was rapidly emerging as one of the most notorious poisoners of the Victorian age. When Chapman first appeared before the police court, Detective Inspector Godley opened what would soon become a much larger investigation. His immediate objective was simple: keep Chapman in custody while the inquiry continued. Godley told the court that Maud Marsh was not the first woman to have died under suspicious circumstances after becoming involved with Chapman. He pointed out that other women connected to him had also died following illnesses that bore striking similarities to Maud's. Chapman's solicitor dismissed suggestions as little more than coincidence. He immediately applied for bail, arguing that the evidence was still limited and that his client was a respectable licensed publican with an established business. Inspector Godley strongly opposed the application, warning that Chapman might abscond if released. The magistrate agreed. Bail was refused and Chapman was remanded in custody. Meanwhile, the medical investigation continued. A more detailed post-mortem examination was carried out under the direction of Dr. Thomas Stevenson, the Home Office's leading toxicology expert. Dr. Stoker was among those present and provided evidence regarding Maud's illness and death. Initially, The doctors could find no natural disease capable of explaining her sudden decline. Attention then turned to the preserved organs that Dr. Stoker had carefully removed and submitted for analysis. After several days of testing, Dr. Stevenson reached a startling conclusion. Maud Marsh's organs, he reported, contained large quantities of antimony. The poison was present in concentrations that could not be explained by normal medicinal use. The investigators also analysed a bottle containing a mixture of brandy and water that had been recovered from Maud's bedroom. Testing revealed enough antimony in the liquid to prove potentially fatal. The medical mystery had finally been solved. Maud Marsh had been poisoned. On the 5th of November 1902, Maud was laid to rest. But the investigation was only just beginning. Among the items recovered from Chapman's premises were medical textbooks, reference work dealing with poisons, and a book written by famous Victorian executioner James Berry. The discovery attracted considerable attention, although Berry himself reportedly expressed displeasure at finding his work associated with the case. As detectives expanded their inquiry beyond Maud's death, it quickly became clear that the case would not be resolved in a matter of weeks. Investigators increasingly suspected that other women connected to Chapman had died in similar circumstances, and proving that would require reopening deaths that had long been accepted as natural. At the early court hearings, it was announced that further adjournments would be necessary while the bodies of Mary Spink and Bessie Taylor were exhumed and examined. The proceedings dragged on for months. Again and again, Chapman was brought before the magistrates, while detectives, doctors and forensic specialists painstakingly assembled evidence stretching back almost a decade. By the time he was finally committed for trial, the prosecution had built a formidable case supported by medical findings, toxicological evidence and witness testimony relating to the deaths of the three women. The most significant development came with the exhumations. Mary Spink's body was recovered from a cemetery in Leighton, while Bessie Taylor's remains were exhumed from the burial ground in Cheshire. What investigators discovered was extraordinary. Despite the passage of time, the remains were sufficiently preserved to permit detailed toxicological examination. Scientists were able to determine that neither woman had died from the natural illnesses recorded at the time of their deaths. Instead, significant quantities of poison were found within their bodies. The findings transformed the case. What had begun as a single murder investigation was now emerging as a series of calculated poisonings spanning several years. Detectives no longer believed they were dealing with one suspicious death. They were uncovering the work of what we now call a serial killer. As the investigation progressed, detectives had begun examining the mass documents seized from Chapman's premises. Once translated, the papers revealed a remarkable discovery. The man known throughout London as George Chapman was not an American, as he had often claimed. In reality, he was a Polish immigrant named Severin Klosowski. To ensure the legal proceedings were accurate, the authorities began referring to him by his birth name. When the name Severin Klosowski was read out to him, Chapman reportedly denied knowing anyone by that name. The discovery opened up an entirely new avenue of investigation. Detectives traced people who had known Klosowski during his early years in Britain. Among those located was Lucy Badersky, who identified Chapman as the man she had known years before under his original name. By now, the police believed they were dealing with far more than a single suspicious death. Chapman was formally accused of being responsible for the deaths of Maud Marsh, Mary Isabella Spink and Bessie Taylor. As the months passed, however, public interest began to wane. When Chapman was first arrested, newspapers had devoted extensive coverage to the sensational allegations. But with the repeated adjournments and the slow pace of the legal process made it difficult to sustain public interest. By the time the case finally reached trial, much of the initial frenzy had faded. That would soon change. The trial of George Chapman began at the Central Criminal Court, better known as the Old Bailey, on the 16th of March 1903, more than 4 months after his arrest. The case was held before Mr. Justice Grantham. Leading the prosecution was the Solicitor General Sir Edward Carson, assisted by Charles Matthews and Travers Humphreys Bodkin. The defence team consisted of George Eliot, Arthur Hutton and V. Lyons. The courtroom was packed. Spectators crowded the galleries, eager to witness one of the most unusual murder trials of the age. When asked to enter his plea, Severin Klosowski, known to the public as George Chapman, pleaded not guilty. Despite the growing allegations surrounding several deaths, Chapman faced trial for only one murder, that of Maud Marsh. The prosecution's challenge was therefore straightforward but formidable. They had to prove beyond reasonable doubt that Maud had been deliberately poisoned by Chapman. Sir Edward Carson persuaded the court to admit evidence relating to the deaths of Mary Spink and Bessie Taylor. The prosecution argued that the striking similarities between the 3 cases demonstrated a consistent pattern of behaviour and made accidental poisoning highly unlikely. One by one, witnesses described the same disturbing sequence of events. A woman would begin living with Chapman as his wife. After a period of apparent happiness, she would develop severe stomach complaints, persistent sickness, diarrhoea, and a gradual physical decline. Doctors would struggle to explain the symptoms. The woman would eventually die, and later poison would be found in her body. The prosecution argued that Maud Marsh had been subjected to repeated dose of antimony over an extended period before receiving a final fatal dose shortly before her death. Expert witnesses explained how tartar emetic, a preparation containing antimony, could easily be dissolved in food or drink without attracting suspicion. Over the course of the trial, the jury heard in detail about the illnesses and the deaths of Mary Spink, Bessie Taylor and Maud Marsh. Different women, different years. Yet, according to the prosecution, the same deadly pattern every time. The defence faced an extremely difficult task. From the outset, Chapman's barrister George Eliot argued that the prosecution case rested heavily on expert opinion and circumstantial evidence. There was no direct eyewitness account of poisoning, and much of the case depended on medical interpretation and toxicological findings. However, as the trial progressed, the accumulation of witness testimony, medical reports and forensic analysis created a powerful narrative for the prosecution. 3 women spanning several years had suffered remarkably similar illnesses. In each case, antimony had been detected. Eliot, recognising the difficulty of challenging the scientific evidence, shifted his focus. One of his key arguments was directed at prejudice. He reminded the jury that Chapman was not English by birth, born Severin Klosowski in Poland, then part of the Russian Empire. He had come to Britain as an immigrant. Eliot suggested that his client's foreign origins might unconsciously influence how he was perceived in court. The defence argument was clear. Chapman must be judged solely on the evidence, not on his nationality or background. The prosecution and the judge swiftly rejected any implication that prejudice should play a role in the case. They emphasised that the jury was not being asked to consider where Chapman came from, but whether the evidence proved he had committed the offences charged. Prosecuting counsel maintained that nationality was entirely irrelevant. The central issue remained the same, whether Chapman had poisoned Maud Marsh. As the trial drew to a close, the judge delivered his summing up, carefully reviewing evidence that had been presented over several days of the proceedings. After hearing medical testimony, forensic analysis, and detailed accounts of Maud Marsh's illness and death, the jury retired to consider their verdict. They were absent from the courtroom for just 11 minutes. When they returned, the atmosphere in the court shifted immediately. The foreman stood and announced George Chapman was found guilty of murder. As was customary, the clerk asked the condemned man whether he had anything to say before the sentence was passed. Chapman offered no reply. Following his conviction, he was transferred to Wandsworth Prison to await execution. At the time, there was no court of criminal appeal. Once the sentence of death had been passed, the only remaining hope was a petition for mercy to the Home Secretary. Chapman's solicitor submitted the customary appeal, but the request for clemency was refused. Inside the prison, officials noted that Chapman became increasingly withdrawn. He refused to see visitors and kept largely to himself. The only person who attempted to visit him was his wife, Louisa, otherwise known as Lucy, but he declined to see her. As the date of execution approached, Chapman continued to insist that he was innocent, claiming he was not Severin Klosowski. He alleged that police evidence had been fabricated and that witnesses had committed perjury. On the 7th of April 1903, George Chapman was taken to the gallows at Wandsworth Prison. With his death, one of the most controversial murder cases of the Edwardian era came to an end. But the questions surrounding his crimes would continue to be debated for decades to come. With the investigation into George Chapman complete, a remarkable theory began to circulate among some police officers and later among the press. They suggested there might be a connection between Chapman and one of the most infamous unsolved murder cases in British history, the Whitechapel murders, the killer known as Jack the Ripper. The idea quickly spread, not only in Britain but internationally, capturing public imagination long after Chapman's execution. The speculation was based largely on timing and geography. Severin Klosowski is believed to have arrived in Britain in the late 1880s, placing him in the country around the time the Whitechapel murders began. The first canonical victim, Mary Ann Nichols, was found in Bucks Row, Whitechapel, in the early hours of the 31st of August 1888. Just over a week later, on the 8th of September, Annie Chapman was discovered in Hanbury Street, a short distance away. After a brief pause in the killings, another woman was murdered on the 30th of September. Elizabeth Stride was found in Duffield's Yard, off Burner Street. Unlike the earlier victims, she had not been mutilated in the same way, leading some investigators to believe her killer may have been interrupted. Later that same night, Catherine Eddowes was discovered in Mitre Square, Aldgate. Whether Stride and Eddowes were killed by the same hand remains a subject of debate, but at the time the police treated the events as part of a single escalating series. The final and most notorious of the Whitechapel murders occurred on the 9th of November 1888. That morning, the body of Mary Jane Kelly was discovered in her small room at Miller's Court, off Dorset Street in Spitalfields. Even among the already horrific crimes, the scene was exceptional in its brutality. Unlike the previous murders, Kelly had been killed in private, allowing the attacker time to inflict the grotesque injuries. Her landlord had sent a man to collect overdue rent. When there was no response at her door, he looked through a broken window and he saw the body inside. Witnesses later recalled that Kelly had been heard singing that night. At some point in the early hours, she had encountered the killer. She would become the fifth canonical victim attributed to Jack the Ripper. After her death, the series of mutilation murders abruptly ceased. The Whitechapel killer was never identified and no arrest was ever made, and the case remained one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in British criminal history. One witness later provided a description of a man that was seen with Mary Kelly earlier that night. He described him as looking respectable and well dressed, approximately 5 feet 6 inches tall, and around 34 to 35 years of age. The man was described as wearing a dark overcoat trimmed with astrakhan fur, a black necktie secured with a horseshoe-shaped pin, and boots fitted with dark gaiters fastened by light-coloured buttons. Around his waist hung a heavy gold watch chain. To those who saw him, he looked neat, composed and respectable. This description, often linked to the final hours of Mary Jane Kelly, has often become one of the most frequently repeated accounts in the Whitechapel case files. However, it is important to note that it comes from witness recollections, and its reliability has long been debated. After Kelly's murder in November 1888, the series of mutilation killings abruptly ceased. Yet the name Jack the Ripper did not disappear. Newspaper speculation kept the figure alive in the public imagination, and in later years additional unsolved murders of women in London were sometimes loosely grouped within the broader Metropolitan Police classification, known as the Whitechapel murders. Even after the canonical series ended, fears persisted that the killer had either returned or that similar crimes were being committed by a copycat, a theory that, it's been said, some of the senior officers also had. George Chapman was among the many individuals later proposed as a possible suspect. Modern theorists have pointed to several perceived similarities. The Whitechapel murder attributed to Jack the Ripper occurred in August 1888. Around this period, Chapman is believed to have been living in or near London's East End, placing him in relative proximity to the crimes. Unlike many other suspects suggested over the years, Chapman's medical knowledge with the hospital experience in Poland has been cited by theorists as the kind of anatomical knowledge some believed the killer possessed. There were also comparisons drawn between witness descriptions and Chapman's appearance. The man seen with Mary Jane Kelly was described as being 5 foot 6 inches tall, aged in his mid-30s, with a moustache and a generally respectable appearance. Details that some later writers argued bore a resemblance to Chapman. Other points have also been raised in retrospective theories, including Chapman's occasional use of American expressions. These details were sometimes linked by theorists to the so-called Dear Boss letter, which contained phrases some believed sounded American. However, none of these similarities were ever considered proof by the original Ripper investigators. Another argument sometimes raised by those who believe in a connection between George Chapman and Jack the Ripper concerns his personality. Some witnesses described Chapman as an intelligent man but had a dark sense of humour when he occasionally made reference to death and suffering. To some theorists, this appeared to echo the taunting tone found in certain letters sent to the police. However, these are just theories. Attention also turned to the timing. The final widely accepted Ripper murder occurred in November 1888. After the killing of Mary Jane Kelly, the series of mutilation murders in London came to an abrupt end. No further crimes were linked to Jack the Ripper. Chapman is believed to have been living and working in London during this period, before moving abroad. His movements during the late 1880s and early 1890s have been used by some writers to place him within the proximity of the Whitechapel murders. In later years, some authors suggested that similar unsolved murders in the United States might be attributed to Chapman. However, modern research has found no conclusive evidence linking Chapman to any American crimes. His exact whereabouts during this period remain debatable, and there's no documented proof to connect him to any crime in America. Chapman is generally believed to have returned to England around 1892. Former Chief Inspector Frederick Abberline, one of the detectives who had investigated the Whitechapel murders, later expressed the belief that George Chapman might have been Jack the Ripper. Following Chapman's conviction for poisoning his wives, Abberline was reported as saying, "You've got Jack the Ripper at last." He's also claimed to have a score of reasons for suspecting Chapman, citing his presence in the East End during the murders and other circumstances that he believed linked him to the crimes. However, Abberline never published a detailed case against Chapman, and his views remained a personal conviction rather than a conclusion accepted by all the investigators. For those who support the theory, the pattern still appears compelling. They suggested that if Chapman had once been responsible for the Whitechapel murders, he may have abandoned that method of killing as the risks increased. The intense police presence and growing public panic in London would have made his extremely violent mode of killing increasingly dangerous, and the public were more alert. Poison offered a quieter alternative, one that left little immediate evidence and allowed a killer to operate within their own home without attracting suspicion. It is a theory that writers and amateur investigators have looked into for decades. However, there is no confirmed historical evidence that any of the original investigators formally concluded that George Chapman was Jack the Ripper. Modern historians remain divided. Some point to intriguing overlaps in timing and behaviour, while others dismiss the theory as coincidence. And so the question remains unresolved. Was George Chapman simply a Victorian poisoner, or was he, as some have speculated, hiding a far darker past beneath the name Severin Klosowski? Thank you for watching, or even just listening.